I bought this house in a suburb of Indiana at the end of last year, in an older part of the city where almost everything was built in the 60s and 70s. I was 29 at the time, moving out of a small apartment and tired of paying rent that only kept going up. I work remotely in technical support, so I spent most of the day at home, and the idea of having a place that was mine seemed too good to ignore. The price was what hooked me. It was low enough that my friends said, "There's something wrong with that." The inspection didn't point out anything outrageous beyond the obvious. Old wiring in some spots, a musty smell in the basement, some crooked walls. The house had been empty for a while, according to the realtor, and I accepted it because I wanted to believe it was just a rare opportunity. On the first Saturday after getting the keys, I went down to the basement to start organizing. The basement was half finished, that strange way you see a lot around here. Part of it had beige painted drywall, another part still had exposed concrete and some pipes visible on the ceiling. The lighting was just simple bulbs and sockets, and even with everything on, it stayed kind of dark in the corners. It was cold down there, even with the heat on upstairs, and there was a constant smell of damp dust, like wet cardboard. I brought a drill, screws, some metal shelves I bought at Walmart, and a box of tools. I wanted to mount the shelves against a wall where the drywall was poorly aligned, with ripples that made it look like someone had done it in a hurry. While I measured and tapped the end of the tape measure against the wall, I heard a muffled sound, very low, like someone moving something behind it. I froze for a second and tried to explain it to myself as just the heater, or water in the pipes, or the house settling like everyone says. I ignored it at first. Old houses make noise, I knew that, and I didn't want to fall into paranoia on the very first day. I kept marking points on the wall, but the sound came back. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a sharp impact. It was more like something being dragged slowly, a muffled noise, almost like fabric scraping against wood. I stopped again, held my breath without realizing it, and stood there in silence for a few seconds. The basement felt even quieter when I turned off the drill. I could hear the low hum of the light bulb and my own heart beating faster than it should. I pressed my ear against the wall, feeling a little embarrassed with myself, and felt the cold drywall against my cheek. I didn't hear anything at that moment. I kept repeating to myself that it was in my head, that I was alone there, that no one would be inside the wall of a house that had been legally sold. Still, something didn't sit right. That wall felt different from the others. When I knocked lightly with my knuckles, the sound wasn't hollow in the normal way. There was a specific section that sounded more dead, like there was less space behind it. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it sideways, and I could see a strange line in the paint, almost invisible, like someone had closed that section off afterward. Nothing well done, just enough not to draw attention during a quick visit. I stood there for a while, staring, feeling that tightness in my stomach that you try to ignore. I ended up grabbing an old utility knife from the toolbox and made a small cut in the drywall, more to prove to myself that I was overreacting. When I pulled a piece of the board away, the air that came out was different. It smelled like something sealed off, like old sweat mixed with plastic and dust. The flashlight illuminated a narrow space. I could barely see the back, but enough to realize that it wasn't just a technical gap. Inside, there was a thin mattress leaning against the wall, crumpled, and several empty water bottles scattered on the floor. I stood there, holding the flashlight with a slightly trembling hand, trying to process what I was seeing. It made no sense at all. The space was narrow. It was clear that someone could only lie down or sit halfway there without being able to stand properly. Besides the mattress, there were crushed food wrappers, the kind from cheap sandwiches, and an open package of cookies. Everything looked too recent to be old forgotten trash. There wasn't dust settled on top of things, and the mattress still had that strong body smell, a sour human smell. I felt a chill run up my back, not just from the cold basement air, but from the slow realization that someone had been there, maybe still was. I instinctively looked around the basement, even though I knew there was no one else there with me at that moment. The stairs leading upstairs creaked lightly with the warm air rising, and every noise the house made seemed louder than before. I closed the hole in the drywall as best I could, fitting the piece back without screwing it in, more out of reflex than logic. My mind was trying to find simple explanations. Maybe it was a homeless person who had gotten in before I bought the house. Maybe the realtor didn't know. Maybe there was a hidden external entrance. I walked the perimeter of the house that same day, checked doors, basement windows, those small windows near ground level. Everything was locked, intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken wood, no shattered glass. The only way to access that space was from inside the basement, through the wall I had just opened. That unsettled me more than anything else. By late afternoon, I went upstairs, took a long shower, trying to wash that smell out of my head, and decided I would deal with it the next day. I told myself I was tired, that I was exaggerating, that sleeping would help me think more clearly. It was already night when I went to bed. The house was silent in that strange way empty houses get. No neighbor noise, no nearby traffic, just the heating turning on and off now and then. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize everything. I thought that if someone had been living there hidden, they must have left when the house was put up for sale. It made sense in my head, but my body didn't follow. My stomach felt knotted, and there was a constant tension in my shoulders, like I was waiting for something to happen. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up suddenly, with that feeling that something pulled you out of sleep for no clear reason. The room was dark, just a little street light coming in through the gap in the curtain. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't heavy or rushed. They were slow, careful footsteps coming from below me, from the basement. I sat up in bed slowly, trying not to make any noise, and listened. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds, then started again, as if the person were walking back and forth, stepping carefully to avoid making sound. The noise was muffled by the floor, but unmistakable. It didn't sound like pipes, didn't sound like the house settling. It was the sound of someone moving. My first instinct was to think I was dreaming, but the cold I felt in my hands and the way my breathing shortened told me I was fully awake. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time. It was a little after 2 in the morning. I sat there trying to decide what to do, my mind spinning between calling the police, getting up to check, or just staying still and pretending I hadn't heard anything. The most disturbing part was realizing that if someone really was in the basement, that person knew I was upstairs sleeping. I got out of bed carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The bedroom floor creaked in some spots, so I stepped slowly, remembering exactly where it usually made noise during the day. I grabbed a thick t-shirt and put it on because the air in the house felt colder at that hour. Or maybe it was just my body reacting. I took a small flashlight from the drawer and unlocked the bedroom door without turning on any lights. The hallway felt different at night, narrower with heavier shadows in the corners. I stopped at the top of the stairs leading to the main floor and listened. The footsteps continued, now closer to the basement stairs, that same light wood creak I had heard earlier, but now with a rhythm that wasn't random. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cold, and my mind kept repeating that maybe the best thing was to leave the house right then, but my legs wouldn't move. I went down the steps slowly, gripping the flashlight too tightly, my hand aching from squeezing it. Each step felt too tall, and the silence between one step and the next was suffocating. When I got close to the basement door, the sound stopped again. I stood there, hearing only my own heart, loud enough to feel like a drum in my chest. The door was closed, just the way I had left it before going up to sleep. I put my hand on the doorknob and felt the metal cold, almost damp. I waited a few more seconds, trying to hear any breathing, any movement on the other side. Nothing. I opened the door slowly, just enough to slide the flashlight inside. The basement stairs descended into dimness, and the smell came back instantly. That sealed-off smell, mixed with something stronger, human. The flashlight beam shook as I pointed it downward, and that's when I saw that the piece of drywall I had put back was on the floor, leaning against the wall, as if someone had pushed it out from the inside. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to convince my brain that it could have fallen on its own. Poorly fitted drywall, gravity, anything. But I knew it hadn't fallen like that. It was leaned carefully, too carefully to be an accident. I went down a few more steps, feeling the cold of the concrete rise through my feet even with my thin socks. The basement looked different from the afternoon. The dim light flattened everything, and the shadows made the walls seem closer. I aimed the flashlight directly at the space behind the wall. The mattress was no longer leaning the same way. It had been pulled a little forward, as if someone had recently come out of there. One of the water bottles was still standing, gently rocking, like it had been bumped just seconds earlier. The silence down there wasn't comfortable. It was loaded, like the air was too heavy to breathe deeply. That's when I heard a sound behind me. Not in the basement. Upstairs. A light creak, short, exactly like the floor made when someone stepped near my bedroom. My stomach dropped instantly. That meant whoever had been in the basement was no longer there. I turned off the flashlight instinctively, as if that could hide me, and stayed still, trying not to make any noise. The darkness became almost complete, with just a bit of light coming from the open door. I heard another step, clearer this time, and then nothing. No voice, no cough, nothing that gave me a clear clue. My mind started racing with horrible possibilities, but at the same time I tried to cling to any explanation that was less absurd. Maybe it was an old house noise, maybe fear was mixing everything up. Even so, I went back up the stairs with my heart in my throat, each step feeling too tall, with the constant sensation that someone was right behind me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped before entering the hallway. I stood there listening, my whole body tense. The house felt empty again, too silent. No footsteps, no sound from upstairs. Still, I couldn't go straight back to my bedroom. I opened every door slowly, one by one, checking the bathroom, the guest room, even the hallway closet. Everything was just as I had left it. The windows were locked, the curtains in place. There was no sign that anyone had passed through, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. My chest felt tight and I realized I was breathing shallowly, like I couldn't fill my lungs properly. I went back to my bedroom, locked the door, and pushed the dresser slightly forward, more to give myself some sense of control than as any real strategy. I barely slept after that. I lay there staring into the darkness, phone in hand, thinking about whether to call the police or not. Every time I imagined explaining the situation out loud, it sounded too absurd. I think someone lives hidden behind the wall in my basement. Didn't sound like something they would take seriously. Time passed slowly and I listened to every creak, every change in the sound of the house. Near 5 in the morning, when it started to get a little lighter outside, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a low sound, like something being dragged slowly in the basement. I didn't get up. I stayed frozen, my whole body rigid, waiting for it to stop. And it did. Suddenly, as if it had never existed. When the sun finally came through the window, I got up, grabbed my most important things, left the house, and went straight to the police station. When I told everything, the officer tried to keep a serious face, but it was clear he was skeptical. Even so, they went with me to the house. They searched the basement, opened the wall completely. The space was bigger than I imagined, but it was empty. The mattress was gone. The wrappers, too. Only marks remained on the floor and wall, as if something had been dragged away in a hurry. They said they found no signs of forced entry and suggested that maybe someone had access before, or that I had gotten scared by normal house noises. None of them could explain how someone could have left unseen that night. I never slept in that house again. I put it up for sale a few weeks later. To this day, when I wake up in the middle of the night from any noise, the first thing I think of is that space behind the wall and the uncomfortable certainty that, that night, I was not alone. Story 2. I'm a college student, I'm 22 years old, and last semester I moved to Madison, Wisconsin to be closer to campus. I needed something cheap and quick, and I ended up renting the basement of a shared house in a very typical residential neighborhood, the kind with old trees and quiet streets at night. The listing said, separate unit, its own entrance through the backyard, private bathroom, everything simple but functional. The landlord lived upstairs, but made it clear that he was hardly ever home. I believed I lived alone down there. At that point in my life, I was focused on classes, a part-time job at the library, and sleeping very little. The basement had a bedroom, a small living room with old carpet, a makeshift kitchen, and a utility area where the boiler was. It was cold down there, even with the heat on, and there was always a faint smell of hot metal mixed with dust. Nothing out of the ordinary, I thought. I felt safe enough, at least at first. On the night everything happened, I had gotten back late after studying at the library. I took a shower, ate something quick, and lay down around midnight. The silence down there was constant, broken only by the low sound of the boiler kicking on now and then. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were far too clear to be pipes or wood settling. They were coming from the laundry area, on the other side of the wall from my bedroom. I froze, trying to make sense of it, telling myself it had to be the owner arriving or moving around upstairs. But the footsteps sounded too close, as if they were on the same level as me. I got out of bed slowly, feeling that strange cold in my stomach, and opened my bedroom door just a little. The dim light from the living area illuminated the boiler space, and that's when I noticed something I had never seen before. Behind the boiler, half hidden by shadows and pipes, there was a narrow door made of dark wood, with no handle on the outside. I felt an immediate chill, because I was certain that door didn't lead anywhere I knew. I moved closer slowly, trying not to make any noise, with that feeling that every step I took was too loud. The door sat behind the boiler, almost flush with the wall, and looked old, different from the other doors in the basement. There was no handle, no visible lock on my side, just smooth wood and a small gap at the bottom. The air there felt warmer, and there was a strange smell, like stale air mixed with something damp, almost like trapped breath. I stood there, not daring to touch it, just watching. That's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't sharp or clearly defined, but something moved on the other side of the door, blocking for a second the small amount of light coming through the lower gap. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I took a step back without realizing it, and the carpet made a soft noise, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me freeze. At the same moment, I heard something from the other side. It wasn't a voice, nor a clear step. It was a low, irregular sound, like someone breathing very close to the door. The air seemed to move in and out with effort, and I could hear a faint scraping, like fingers slowly passing over the wood. I stood there completely paralyzed, trying to understand if this was real or if my fear was filling in the gaps. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of duct, maybe trapped air, maybe I was just too tired. But the sound continued steady, and the shadow moved slightly back and forth. I felt my hands start to sweat, and a strange pressure in my chest, as if the space were getting smaller. I took a few more steps back and returned to my bedroom, closed the door carefully and leaned against it, holding my breath, as if that could keep someone from hearing I was there. I sat on the bed for a length of time I can't really measure, just listening. I couldn't hear the breathing sound from the bedroom, but every click of the boiler made my whole body react. I texted a friend saying I had heard strange noises, but I didn't go into detail because it felt ridiculous to write it out. Eventually, I worked up the courage to send a short email to the landlord, asking if there was any room behind the boiler area. He only replied the next morning saying no, that the basement was exactly as described in the contract and that there was no other area down there. He said the space behind the boiler was probably just old structural elements of the house and that I shouldn't worry. His response didn't reassure me at all. On the contrary, it made me more uncomfortable because now I knew that door didn't exist officially. Even so, I tried to go on with my day as usual, went to class, worked, and spent the whole time trying to convince myself that I had overreacted because of exhaustion. That night, I went back to the basement with a knot in my stomach. It was colder than usual, and the boiler took longer to turn on, leaving that heavy silence hanging in the air. Before going to my bedroom, I went straight to look at the door. It was closed, just like before. Nothing looked different at first glance. Still, I stood there watching for a few seconds, feeling that strange smell of stagnant air. That's when I noticed marks on the wood around chest height. Finger marks. They weren't deep, but you could clearly see where someone had pressed against the door from the inside, as if pushing hard. My stomach churned instantly. The wood still felt slightly warm to the touch, as if someone had been there not long ago. I backed away quickly, my legs feeling weak, and that's when I realized the door was no longer locked. It was just resting shut. A small gap let a shadow pass slowly from side to side on the other side. I stared at that gap for a few seconds, unable to decide what to do. The silence was too heavy, and I could hear my own loud breathing in my ears. I stepped back and grabbed my phone, thinking about calling someone, but my fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The shadow on the other side of the door moved again, slowly, like someone carefully shifting position. It didn't look like someone trying to leave in a hurry. It looked like someone waiting. The smell grew stronger at that moment, warm and suffocating, like air that hadn't circulated in a long time. I felt nausea rise and a strange pressure in my head, as if I were in a space that was too small. Without thinking much, I closed my bedroom door, locked it, pushed the desk chair against the handle, and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, trying not to make any noise. I don't know how much time passed before I heard it again. A dry, short sound from the boiler area, like wood scraping against wood. Then another, a bit longer. It wasn't loud, but it was far too deliberate to be the house settling. I covered my mouth with my hand so I wouldn't breathe too loudly and stayed there, motionless, feeling my heart beat so fast it almost hurt. At some point the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I waited to hear footsteps moving away or the boiler turning on, anything to break it. Nothing happened. Only when it started to get light outside did I find the courage to get up. I opened my bedroom door slowly and went to the boiler area. The door was completely open now. From the inside, I could clearly see the finger marks, sharper, as if someone had just let go of the wood. The space beyond was too dark to see how far it went, and the air coming from it was cold and heavy. I didn't go in. I left the house that same day and never went back alone. I went straight to a friend's place and explained everything as simply as I could, trying not to sound too desperate. She insisted I call the police, so I did. When they went to the house with me later, the basement looked different, almost too normal. The door behind the boiler was closed again, with no visible marks on the outside. One of the officers tried to open it and couldn't. He said it seemed jammed or locked from the inside. The landlord showed up later, clearly irritated, and repeated that the space didn't exist in the house records, that it had never been used, and was probably just an old divider with no function. When the officers finally managed to force the door open, it led to a narrow space, unlit, just concrete and dust. No furniture, no obvious passage, nothing to explain the shadows or the sounds. Even so, the smell inside was the same I had felt before, that heavy air, too warm for a closed, abandoned place. I never slept in that basement again. I managed to break the lease a few weeks later, claiming lack of safety, but no one ever gave me a real explanation. The landlord stopped responding to my messages after I moved out. Sometimes I think that if I hadn't gotten up that first night, maybe I never would have noticed that door. Or worse, maybe it would have been opened anyway. To this day, when I smell stale air or hear footsteps in places where no one should be, my body reacts before my mind. I avoid basements now, even well-lit ones, and I always pay attention to doors that don't make sense. Because in that house, underneath everything that looked normal, there was a space that wasn't listed anywhere, and someone knew exactly how to use it. After I left that house, I still had to go back a few times during the day to get the rest of my things. I always took someone with me. Even in the morning, with sunlight coming through the small basement windows, the place felt wrong. The boiler area had that same stale smell, and I avoided looking directly at the door. One of those times when I went to get a suitcase I had left in the bedroom, I noticed that the carpet near the boiler was marked, as if something heavy had been dragged from there toward the stairs. They weren't obvious marks, but the fabric was flattened in a strange way, forming lines that led toward the door. I didn't say anything to anyone because it seemed too small, but it stayed in my mind. I also noticed that the door, that time, was locked again, firmly, as if it had never been opened. That alternation between open and closed, with no explanation, disturbed me more than if it had always been the same. Over time, I tried to go back to my normal life. I returned to my college routine, my job, my new place, but the feeling of safety didn't come back with it. Any noise at night woke me up. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked at all times, even in apartments with other people. I never rented anything in a basement or below ground again. Sometimes, when I think about it all with more distance, I still try to find a logical explanation. Someone using an old part of the house, some hidden passage, something no one ever documented. But nothing explains the finger marks, the smell of breathing, the shadows moving behind the door, or the fact that the space didn't exist officially. What scares me most isn't imagining who was there, but knowing that for weeks I slept just a few meters from a place that shouldn't have existed, and that someone clearly knew exactly how to enter and leave it without being seen. The last time I was at that house was to return the keys. The landlord asked me to leave them on the kitchen table upstairs. I went up with him walking behind me, and the whole time I felt that discomfort in my stomach as if I were doing something wrong just by being there. Before leaving, I asked him directly about the door in the basement without any beating around the bush. He was silent for a few seconds that felt too long, then repeated in a flat tone that there was no other room down there. He said old houses had strange things and that I should forget about it. While he spoke, I noticed that he avoided looking directly at me. He didn't seem nervous, but he seemed closed off, like someone who didn't want to prolong the conversation. I left with the clear feeling that I hadn't imagined anything, but also with the certainty that no one was going to admit what was really happening in that house. It's been a while since then, but it hasn't stayed in the past the way I expected. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I have the impression that I hear footsteps in the hallway of my current apartment, even though I know I live alone. My body reacts before any logical thought. I stand still, listening, waiting for that specific sound of someone moving slowly, too carefully. Nothing ever happens, but the fear stays there, quiet, constant. What bothers me most is knowing that the space behind the boiler didn't appear out of nowhere. Someone built it, someone used it, and someone knew exactly how to hide it. I still think about that door opening from the inside, the fresh finger marks, and the feeling that I came just seconds away from seeing something I should never have seen. After all of this, I tried to look for information on my own. I searched old blueprints of the house, public records, anything that mentioned renovations or structural changes. I found nothing. Officially, the basement was exactly the size stated in the contract. There were no additions, extra divisions, or history of internal modifications. That only reinforced the bad feeling that the space behind the boiler wasn't an administrative error or something forgotten over time. It existed intentionally. Someone built it knowing it shouldn't appear, and someone used it long enough to leave marks, smells, clear signs of human presence. The fact that no one took responsibility or explained anything didn't bring any relief. It only made everything heavier. Today, when I tell this story, I try to keep my tone calm, but I still feel the same chill in my stomach as when I first saw that door. I know it sounds exaggerated to people who've never lived something like this. I try to rationalize it myself, fit it into an acceptable logic, but I always come back to the same point. I heard footsteps where no one should have been, felt breathing behind a door that didn't exist, and saw finger marks that hadn't been there before. This wasn't a dream or a quick misunderstanding. It was something ongoing, lived within a single night that completely changed the way I feel in enclosed spaces. I don't know who was there or how they left. I only know that for weeks I slept thinking I was alone when I clearly wasn't. Story 3. I'm a 17-year-old guy, and this happened last year on a weekend when my parents traveled to visit relatives out of state. We live in a typical suburban house, the kind with a small backyard and a basement used more as extra space than as a main part of the house. I always stayed in the basement when I was home alone because that's where my video game was, along with an old couch and the laundry area. It was basically my refuge. At that time, I spent hours gaming, listening to music with headphones on, and eating whatever frozen thing I could find in the freezer. The basement wasn't exactly cozy, but I was used to it. The lights were dim, the ceiling was low, and it was always a bit cold even in the summer. The house sounded different when no one else was home, more hollow, quieter. Even so, I felt comfortable down there because I'd spent plenty of nights alone without anything happening. That specific night, I had put a load of laundry on because my parents always complained when they came back. The washer was in one corner of the basement facing a plain wall. The lid was dark glass, the kind that reflects everything when the light hits it a certain way. I sat on the couch with the controller in my hand, waiting for the machine to finish, with music playing softly on my phone. At some point, for no clear reason, I lifted my eyes and looked at the washer's glass while it was spinning. It was automatic. In the reflection behind me, someone was standing there. It wasn't sharp, I couldn't really see a face, but it was clearly a person, standing very close to the couch. My body reacted before my mind. I turned around all at once, heart racing, expecting to come face to face with someone. There was no one there. The basement was exactly the way I had left it. The silence felt heavier for a few seconds. I stood there trying to laugh it off, telling myself it was just a weird reflection, a shadow, tiredness. When I looked at the washer again, the reflection came back. This time I looked more carefully, trying not to panic. The machine kept spinning, making that rhythmic sound of water and clothes hitting. In the reflection, the figure was there again, standing in exactly the same spot behind me. I could see the outline of a body. The height looked like an adult's, taller than me. I couldn't see clothes, a face, anything defined. Just a dark shape against the dim basement light. My stomach churned immediately. I turned around slowly, much slower than before, already expecting to find no one. And again, there was nothing. No movement, no sound beyond the washer. The basement door was closed, the stairs empty. I started to break out in a cold sweat, trying to understand how the reflection could show something that wasn't there. I thought maybe it was my own distorted reflection, or some shadow from the couch, but nothing fit. I sat back down, closer to the edge of the couch, my whole body rigid. The machine made another full rotation, and when the glass reflected again, the figure was closer. Not by much, but enough for me to notice the position had changed. Now it seemed almost right behind my back. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I turned off the music on my phone to try to hear better, as if that would help. The basement felt too quiet without the background noise. I didn't want to turn around again, but I did. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's when I started to get the strange feeling of being watched by something that only existed when I wasn't looking directly at it. With every rotation of the machine, I waited for the reflection to appear, and every time it appeared a little closer, until it seemed to take up almost all the space behind me in the glass. I didn't know what else to do except stay still. My entire body was tense, shoulders locked, hands sweaty as I gripped the controller too tightly. The washer kept spinning, that constant sound that started to make me nervous, like a clock counting down to something I didn't want to happen. In the reflection, the figure was now so close it looked like it was leaning forward, as if looking over my shoulder. I could see more clearly the difference between my outline and its, which made it impossible for it to be just a shadow or my own reflection. My brain tried to find a logical explanation, any explanation, but nothing made sense. I turned around again almost angrily, expecting to find someone, anything. The basement was empty. The air felt colder, and I felt a strong chill run up my spine, the kind that makes your stomach drop. The machine made one more rotation, and even before looking, I already knew something had changed. When I stared at the glass, the figure was practically pressed up against me. I couldn't see a face, but the position suggested it was right behind my head. That was the moment the power went out. Everything went dark at once. The washer stopped mid-spin, and the silence that followed was brutal. There was no machine noise, no house noise, no phone sound. I sat there in total darkness, not moving, trying to control my breathing. That's when I heard it, a low, irregular sound coming from right behind me, breathing. It didn't sound like mine. It was too close, too warm. I felt the air hit the back of my neck and froze completely, with the absolute certainty that this time it wasn't just a reflection. I stayed still for several seconds that felt much longer. My body simply wouldn't respond. The breathing behind me continued, slow and uneven, as if someone were trying to control their breath. I felt the warmth on my neck and a faint, strange smell I couldn't quite identify, something between sweat and stale air. I tried to convince myself it could be my own breathing amplified by the silence, but it didn't make sense. The sound came from a fixed point, always the same spot. My head started pounding, and I realized I was breathing too fast, almost hyperventilating. In the total darkness, I stretched my hand out in front of me, searching for the couch, anything that could give me a reference point. I didn't touch anything but air. That's when the sound changed slightly, as if the person behind me had leaned in, getting even closer. On an impulse, I don't even know where it came from, I jumped off the couch and ran toward the basement stairs. I banged my knee on something on the way, felt a sharp pain, but I didn't stop. I ran up the steps, nearly tripping, using my hands to guide myself in the dark. The breathing seemed to follow me for a few seconds, then stayed behind. When I reached the main floor, still without power, I locked the basement door and leaned against it with my full body weight. I stood there, shaking, listening. I didn't hear anything else coming from below. A few minutes later, the power suddenly came back on. The lights turned on and the house went back to normal as if nothing had happened. Even so, I didn't go back down that night. I slept in my parents' bedroom with the door locked, and the next day I spent the entire weekend upstairs. I never used the basement alone again after that. To this day, when I see my reflection in dark glass, I avoid looking for too long. When my parents came back, I tried to tell them what had happened, but it sounded wrong even to me. I talked about the reflection, the power outage, the breathing in the dark. They listened but treated it as a scare. Imagination. A teenager alone in the house. My dad said the washer had mirrored glass and that dim light can play tricks on your mind. My mom said power outages happen in the neighborhood. I wanted to believe them because it was easier. Even so, the next day I went down to the basement with them. Everything looked too normal. The washer was stopped in the same position, nothing out of place. I turned it on again, stood in front of the glass, moved from side to side. Nothing appeared. No strange reflection, no shadow, just me. That made me feel relieved for a few minutes, but it also gave me a bad feeling, like something had simply decided not to show itself anymore. Over time, routine returned, but I was never in the basement the same way again. Whenever the washer was running, I left. I avoided looking at the glass, especially when the light was low. Sometimes, when the machine spins and I walk past the hallway, I get the impression that something moves in the corner of my eye, but when I look directly, there's nothing there. I know it could be in my head that I was 17, alone, tired, with loud music and low light. I repeat that to myself to this day. But what I can't explain is the breathing, the warmth on my neck, the absolute certainty that there was someone there when everything went dark. That doesn't go away with any logical explanation. I still live in this house, but the basement stopped being a refuge. It became just a place I avoid staying in for too long. After that weekend, I started paying attention to things I used to ignore. Small noises, reflections in windows, the way light hits glass surfaces at night. Once, weeks later, I was just passing through the basement to grab something quickly and the washer was off empty. Even so, for a second, I had the clear feeling that something was wrong with the reflection. I didn't see anyone, didn't see any shape, but I felt the same tightness in my chest, the same urgency to get out of there. I ran up the stairs almost at a sprint, trying to laugh it off afterward, but breathing too fast to pretend everything was fine. I never told anyone about that. It seemed too small, but for me it was confirmation that it wasn't just a one-time scare. Today, looking back, I still try to understand what happened that night. Part of me accepts that it could have been a mix of exhaustion, bad lighting, distorted reflection, and fear. But another part can't ignore the simplest and most disturbing detail of all. The reflection changed position. It got closer. That's not something a shadow does on its own. It's not something glass invents by itself. And most importantly, it doesn't explain why, when everything went dark, there was breathing exactly where the reflection said someone was. I didn't see anyone leave. I didn't hear footsteps afterward, just silence. To this day, whenever I'm home alone at night and hear a machine spinning or see my reflection in dark glass, I remember that feeling on my neck and avoid standing still for too long, because at least once I was certain that my reflection wasn't alone. Story 4. I'm 31 years old and live alone in a row house in Pittsburgh, one of those very common ones attached to the neighboring house, with 3 levels counting the basement. I bought the house after a long breakup, more out of a need to start over than excitement. I work from home as an administrative analyst, so I spend a lot of time alone, which has never really been a problem for me. The basement was always just a storage space. It's old with exposed stone walls, an uneven concrete floor, and a constant smell of dampness, even when it hasn't been raining. I almost never stay down there for long. I only go down to store boxes, suitcases, things I don't use every day. The week this happened, I was in a very calm phase of life. Normal routine, nothing out of the ordinary. And I think it's important to say that because there was no reason for me to be anxious or expecting something to go wrong. That night it rained heavily. One of those long, noisy rains that makes water run through the gutters nonstop. I fell asleep to the sound of rain hitting the roof and woke up early the next morning, while it was still somewhat dark. I went down to the basement because I needed to grab a box with old documents to deal with a work issue. As soon as I reached the last step of the stairs, I noticed the smell of wet earth, stronger than usual. The basement light was on, and when I looked at the floor, it took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. There were muddy footprints spread across the concrete. They weren't splashes or dragged marks. They were clearly defined footprints, like someone had just walked in there with dirty shoes. What made me stop immediately was realizing they didn't come from the small basement window or from any wall. They started in the middle of the room, as if someone had simply appeared there. I stood on the last step for a moment, trying to organize the scene in my head. The footprints weren't scattered chaotically. They formed a clear path with the normal spacing of someone walking slowly. They weren't small or overly large, just average adult footprints like someone wearing regular sneakers. The mud was still damp, with that dark shine typical of freshly wet soil, and in some spots I could even see the tread pattern of the sole. The basement had been closed since the last time I'd gone down there days earlier, and I remembered that clearly because I always locked the door out of habit. The small window near the ceiling was closed and clean, with no sign of water or dirt around it. I went down 2 more steps, my heart starting to race, and followed the marks with my eyes. They went in an almost straight line without hesitation, as if whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. The footprints led straight to the stairs. They climbed step by step, leaving lighter marks as the mud wore off. I began to feel real physical discomfort, a knot in my stomach and a strange warmth in my face, like my body was reacting before my mind could catch up. It didn't look like vandalism. It didn't look like a prank. There were no other marks on the floor, no splashes on the walls, just that specific, deliberate trail. When my eyes reached the top of the stairs, my body froze. The footprints ended there, on the last step, outside the basement, exactly in front of my bedroom door. The door was closed, the way I always leave it at night. I stood there staring at it for several seconds, trying to convince myself there had to be some simple explanation I hadn't seen yet. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became that someone had walked up those stairs and stopped there, right in front of where I sleep. I climbed the stairs slowly, carefully avoiding stepping on the marks as if that mattered somehow. Each step felt higher than usual, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like I was doing something I shouldn't. When I reached the upper floor, I stood in the hallway staring at my bedroom door. The footprints stopped just inches from it. There were no marks going back down, no sign that someone had continued down the hall. It was as if the person had climbed up, stopped there, and then simply vanished. I touched the doorknob and felt that it was cold, the way it gets when no one has touched it for a while. I opened the door slowly and looked inside the bedroom. Everything was exactly as I'd left it the night before. The bed messily made, the window closed, nothing out of place. Even so, I went in feeling a strong discomfort, almost a strange sense of shame, as if I were intruding into a space that was no longer just mine. After spending a few minutes walking around the house trying to check everything, I went back to the basement with a bucket of water and cleaning supplies. Part of me wanted to erase it all as quickly as possible, to pretend I'd never seen it. As I cleaned the floor, I could feel the texture of the still fresh mud through the cloth, which only made everything more real. It wasn't dust. It wasn't an old mark. It had been made that night. The more I cleaned, the more I thought about the idea of someone inside the house while I slept. Standing silently outside my bedroom door, I finished cleaning everything, went upstairs, locked the basement door, and tried to go about my day normally. But the feeling didn't go away. All day long, I kept replaying the image of those footprints climbing the stairs one by one and stopping exactly where they did. By late afternoon, as I started to feel more tired, the rational part of me tried to take over. I thought maybe someone had come in during the heavy rain and left the same way, and I just hadn't noticed other marks. I checked doors, windows, locks again. Everything was closed, nothing forced. The front door made the same dry click it always did when I tested the lock. The basement window was still clean with no mud around it, no marks on the sill. The more I tried to prove to myself that there was a simple explanation, the more I felt that tension deep in my stomach, like something was wrong in a way I couldn't fix. That night I walked around the house unnecessarily, turning lights on and off just to be sure I was alone. When I went to bed, I left all the lights off but took a long time to fall asleep. I lay on my side staring at my bedroom door, which I'd locked, listening for any small sound the house might make. The rain had already stopped, which made everything even quieter. At some point during the night, I woke up with the feeling that I'd dreamed about the footprints, but when my eyes fully opened, the memory came back in full. I got up to use the bathroom and walked through the hallway carefully, barely breathing. I stopped for a second at the top of the basement stairs and stared into the darkness below. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. Even so, I had the clear impression that the space felt different, as if something had passed through there and left more behind than just visible marks. I went back to my bedroom and locked the door again, my hand trembling slightly. I woke up early the next day with a heavy feeling in my body, as if I'd slept poorly all night, even though I remembered falling asleep at some point. The first thing I did was go to the hallway and look at the top of the basement stairs. There was nothing there, of course. The floor was clean and dry. Even so, I stood there for a few seconds trying to understand why my body was still reacting as if there were danger. I went down only halfway, without turning on the light, and listened. The basement was silent, with that damp, muffled quiet it always had, but now it felt more closed in, heavier. There was no smell of wet earth this time, just the usual mustiness. I went back upstairs with a brief sense of relief, the kind that doesn't last, and spent the rest of the morning trying to work, but my mind kept returning to the image of the footprints appearing out of nowhere, right in the middle of the room. Later, I decided to tell my sister over the phone. She tried to be practical, asking if I was sure I hadn't tracked mud in from the yard on another day, or if a neighbor could have entered by mistake. I answered everything, but none of her questions really fit what I'd seen. What bothered me most wasn't just the presence of the footprints, but their path. They didn't explore the house. They weren't random. They went straight up, without hesitation, to my bedroom door. There was no curiosity there. There was intention. After that, I started locking my bedroom door every night, something I'd never done before, and I avoid going down to the basement unless necessary. To this day, when it rains heavily at night, I wake up a few times to check the hallway with that quiet fear of finding new marks, as if someone still knows exactly where I sleep. A few weeks later, I almost managed to convince myself it had been an isolated event. My routine gradually returned to normal, and the house started to feel like just a house again. Even so, I never left the basement unlocked again. One Saturday morning, after another night of light rain, I went down to get a suitcase. There were no footprints this time, but something was different. The floor looked like it had been cleaned in some spots and not in others, as if someone had quickly wiped it without much care. There were no clear footprints, just darker areas, and others that were drier. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide if it was just the usual dampness of the place. My body, however, reacted the same way it had the first time. That immediate tension, that feeling that I wasn't alone, even without any concrete sign. I grabbed the suitcase and went back upstairs quickly, closing the door behind me harder than necessary. Since then, nothing else as obvious has happened. No new footprints, no clear noises, nothing I could point to and say, "This proves something." But the feeling never went away. Sometimes at night I wake up with the impression that someone is standing in the hallway, the same way those footprints stopped. I never see anything when I look, just the normal emptiness of the house. Even so, I always stand there for a few seconds listening before moving. I know I don't have proof that anyone came in again. I only know that those footprints appeared where they shouldn't have, climbed to where it made no sense to stop, and disappeared without explanation. And that was enough to completely change the way I feel inside my own home. Story 5. I'm 34 years old and moved back to Ohio a few months after my divorce. It wasn't exactly a planned choice. It was more a lack of options. The house belonged to my family, where I grew up, and it had been empty since my parents moved years earlier. Staying there felt easier than trying to start from scratch somewhere else. I work in a hybrid setup, so I spent several days at home, trying to reorganize my life and my thoughts. The house was old, typical of an American residential neighborhood with a medium-sized yard, a detached garage, and a large basement underneath. The basement was always kind of off-limits when I was a kid. Not because it was scary, but because it was full of old stuff, boxes, broken furniture. After I grew up, no one ever really went down there. When I came back, I realized the basement was exactly the same as it had been decades earlier. as if time had simply stopped down there. The day I decided to clean the basement, it was cold and dry outside. I opened the metal door that led to the stairs and immediately smelled that old scent, a mix of thick dust, aged wood, and dampness. I went down with a flashlight in hand, even though the light worked because the place had always been dim. The floor was bare concrete covered with a thick layer of dust, the kind that tells you no one has stepped there in a very long time. I started moving some boxes, sneezing nonstop, trying to decide what would go in the trash and what might still be useful. At one point, when I pulled an old metal shelf away, I looked at the clean floor beneath it and felt my stomach drop. In the middle of the dust, written in large, clearly marked letters, was my name. Not scribbled, not incomplete. My full name spelled the way it's written today, as if someone had traced it there recently. The dust around it was intact, thick, with no footprints. Just those letters, far too fresh to make sense. I stayed crouched there, staring at it for what felt like too long. I ran my finger over one of the letters to see if it was just my imagination, but the dust shifted easily, confirming it had been written after everything down there had already been undisturbed. The letters had depth, like someone had pressed calmly, not in a hurry. There were no shoe prints around it, no drag marks, nothing to indicate someone walking there. Just the name. My name. My first reaction was to think I might have done it myself at some point and forgotten, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't been down in the basement before that day. The door had been locked when I arrived at the house, and the layer of dust everywhere else confirmed that. I felt a strange chill in my chest, that kind of discomfort that doesn't turn into panic right away but stays there, pressing. I tried to laugh it off to myself without much humor, saying out loud that it was all in my head. I talked to myself as if hearing my own voice would help normalize the situation. I grabbed my phone, took a picture of the floor and sent it to a friend without much context, just saying, "Look at this, how weird." He replied with a joke, asking if I was starting to lose it after the divorce. That bothered me more than it should have. I went back to cleaning the basement, avoiding looking at the name again, but the feeling of being watched began to creep in. Light at first, like a thought you push aside. After a while, I went back upstairs, closed the basement door, and tried to go on with the rest of the day normally, even though the image kept returning to my mind. That night, I was too tired to stay awake thinking about it, but I also couldn't sleep well. The house made the same noises as always, wood creaking, the heating turning on and off, nothing out of the ordinary. Even so, I kept waking up with that annoying feeling that someone was about to call me. At some point during the night, I woke up fully alert without knowing why. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a streetlight through the window. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a clear call. It was someone trying to say my name. The voice was low, hesitant, as if testing the sound. The person mispronounced it, the same way people used to when I was a child. Stretching a syllable that doesn't exist. My stomach turned instantly. No one had called my name that way in decades. I lay there, completely still, trying to decide whether it had been real or some kind of strange dream. The silence returned for a few seconds, long enough for me to almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again. The same attempt, the same wrong pronunciation, this time a little closer, as if it were coming from the hallway. My entire body went rigid. My heart was pounding too hard and my breathing became shallow, carefully controlled so I wouldn't make noise. My mind raced for logical explanations, memory, stress, the old house stirring things from the past. But nothing explained the detail of how the name was said. It wasn't random, it was too specific. I lay there staring into the dark, waiting to hear footsteps or anything that would confirm someone was really there. Nothing happened after that, and at some point I must have fallen asleep again, exhausted. When I woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was check the hallway. The house was silent, pale light coming through the windows, and everything seemed too normal after the night before. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to remember if I'd dreamed the whole thing. My body was still tense, as if I hadn't rested at all. I went down to the kitchen, made coffee, and tried to distract myself with simple things, but the sound of that voice kept replaying in my head, repeating my name incorrectly, insistent. The similarity to my childhood was impossible to ignore. Only one person used to mispronounce it that way when I was little, and thinking about that left a knot in my stomach I couldn't undo. By late morning, I worked up the courage to go back to the basement. I opened the door slowly, expecting to smell that old scent again. I went down the steps carefully and went straight to where I'd seen the name. The dust was still there, but the floor looked different. The letters had been smudged, as if someone had run a hand over them, erasing them in a hurry. They weren't completely gone, but it was clear they were no longer the same clean writing from the day before. My chest tightened immediately. I hadn't been down there since the previous night, and I had no reason to touch that area. I stood there in silence, feeling that discomfort rise again, stronger than before. The basement looked the same as always, yet at the same time it felt different, as if it were no longer just a forgotten part of the house. I swept the flashlight over the floor, the walls, the stacked boxes, looking for any sign that someone else had been there besides me. I found nothing. No footprints, no recent marks on the boxes, no disturbed dust beyond that specific spot. That gave me a strange sense of isolation, as if the space were watching me back. I went upstairs quickly, locked the basement door, and stood in the hallway for a few minutes, breathing deeply, trying to calm myself. I kept telling myself the house held old memories and that my mind was mixing things up because of the difficult moment I was going through. I spent the rest of the day avoiding silence. I left the TV on even when I wasn't watching and made noise on purpose, opening and closing drawers, walking around the house. That night, when I went to bed, I left the bedside lamp on, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. The exhaustion came, but sleep took a long time. I lay there listening to the normal sounds of the house, trying to separate what was real from what my body was turning into a threat. I was almost asleep when I heard it again. This time it was lower, almost a whisper. Someone tried to say my name, got the first syllable wrong, and stopped, as if frustrated. The sound seemed to come from downstairs near the basement door. My stomach flipped immediately and I felt cold sweat on my back. I sat up slowly in bed, careful not to make noise, and listened. The silence after the whisper was heavy, almost pressing against my ears. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, just memory mixed with exhaustion, but my body didn't react as if it were imagination. I felt that strange attention in the air, as if someone were waiting for a response. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear doors, nothing that gave shape to what was happening. Even so, the sense of closeness was too real. I sat there for a long time, staring into the darkness of the room until exhaustion took over again. I slept poorly, waking several times with the impression that someone was about to call my name at any moment. The next day, I called my mother. I didn't tell her everything, just asked casually if she remembered anyone who used to mispronounce my name when I was a child. On the other end of the line, there was a pause that was too brief to be coincidence. She said yes, she remembered, but quickly changed the subject, saying she didn't want to talk about that right now. That unsettled me more than anything else. I hung up with the clear feeling that I'd touched on something I shouldn't have. Later, I went down to the basement door and stood there staring at the doorknob, feeling the same discomfort I'd felt when I saw my name in the dust. I didn't open it, not that day. I spent the rest of the night avoiding silence, but even with the house full of artificial noise, I had the uncomfortable certainty that someone there knew exactly how to call me. That night, I decided I wasn't going down to the basement at all. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it, even knowing it wouldn't really stop anyone, but it gave me a minimal sense of control. I went to bed early, left the light on again, and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound the house made. The heating turned on, the pipes knocked. Everything normal. Still, I felt that same tightness in my chest, like something was about to happen. Near midnight, I heard it again. This time it wasn't a full call. Just the first syllable of my name said the wrong way, drawn out like someone practicing. The sound came clearly from downstairs, not loud, but distinct enough not to be confusion. I held my breath, waiting to hear more. I didn't. The silence afterward was almost worse. The next day, I woke up determined to leave for a while. I packed a small bag and walked around the house, grabbing basic things, avoiding passing near the basement door. Before leaving, I don't know exactly why, I stopped in the hallway and stared at the closed door downstairs. Nothing happened. No sound, no voice. Even so, I felt that strange certainty that it wasn't over. It was just paused. I stayed away for a few days at a friend's house and slept better than I had in weeks. When I returned, the house was silent as always. and the basement remained locked. I never went down there again. The dust, the name, the voice mispronouncing it, all of it stayed down there, along with things that clearly didn't want to be disturbed. Today, whenever someone mispronounces my name, even accidentally, I feel the same chill I felt that night. Because in that house, someone knew my name and knew exactly how to get it wrong. Story 6. I'm 28 years old, and my wife and I moved into an old house in rural Minnesota at the beginning of winter. The house was bigger than we needed, but the rent was too low to ignore. It was a 1950s construction, in a quiet residential neighborhood, wide streets, and almost empty at night. We were coming from small, noisy apartments, so the silence felt like a bonus. Since we both worked from home, we decided to use the basement as a temporary office until we organized the rest of the house better. The basement was large, with concrete walls painted white a long time ago, a low ceiling, and a single small window near the ground. It was cold down there even with the heater on, and there was that constant smell of old dust mixed with metal. Nothing scary, just old, at least at first. During the first week, everything was normal. We spent the day down there, each at an improvised desk with a portable heater on and low music to break the silence. It was on a Tuesday night that we noticed the sound for the first time. It was already late, close to 11, and I had gone down alone to get a file from the computer. The rest of the house was silent. That's when I heard it, a low rhythmic ticking like an old clock marking the seconds. At first I thought it was something in the house, pipes, heating, anything mechanical, but the sound was too regular. I stopped halfway down the stairs and listened. It was clearly coming from the basement. I looked around, tried to identify the source, but there was no clock down there. None on the wall, no box, nothing. When I called my wife to listen, the sound simply stopped. The next day we talked about it lightly, almost like a joke. I said it must be some old house noise, and she agreed, even though she found the precise rhythm strange. During the day, the basement seemed normal, no unusual sounds. We worked down there all day, computers on, heater running, and nothing happened. It was only at night again, when everything became quiet, that the sound returned. This time we were both there. We were sitting in silence, each focused on our own screen, when we clearly heard the ticking coming from somewhere behind us. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. My wife slowly lifted her head and looked at me without saying anything, just pointing with her chin, silently asking if I was hearing it too. I confirmed. The sound seemed to come from the wall opposite the stairs, near where some old boxes from the previous tenant were stored. We stood there for a few minutes just listening. The rhythm didn't change. It was constant, calm, almost irritatingly precise. I went over to the boxes, moved everything, pressed my ear against the cold concrete wall. Nothing there explained it. The strangest part was that as I moved, the sound seemed to change position. It didn't get louder or quieter. It just seemed to come from another spot, as if it were always a certain distance from me. When we went upstairs, the sound continued for a few seconds and then stopped again. That night we went to bed trying not to think too much about it, but I took a long time to fall asleep, with that uncomfortable feeling that something very simple was wrong. Over the next few days, the sound became routine, always at night, always when the house grew quieter. There was no exact time, but it usually started after 10. Sometimes it lasted only a few minutes, sometimes almost an hour. The most uncomfortable part was that it never came from exactly the same place. One night it seemed near the basement stairs, another, deeper inside, near the wall facing the backyard. We started testing silly things to try to explain it. We turned off the heater, then the computers, then anything electrical that could make a rhythmic noise. Nothing changed. The ticking continued, steady, as if it weren't connected to anything we controlled. At one point, my wife commented that it felt like the sound was circling the basement. When she said that out loud, I felt an immediate chill, because it was exactly what I had been feeling but didn't want to admit. One night, more bothered than curious, we decided to go down without turning on the light. We wanted to hear it better, without interference. We stood in the middle of the basement in near total darkness, with only a little light coming from the stairs. The ticking was there, of course, but it felt closer. No longer spread out, but concentrated, as if it were behind the wall where our desk was. I put my hand on the concrete and felt it cold, normal. but the sound seemed to come from inside, not from the other side. My wife asked to go back upstairs, saying that something was starting to feel wrong. When we took our first steps toward the stairs, the sound changed position again, now clearly coming from behind us. It didn't speed up or get louder. It just repositioned itself, as if it were following us. After that night, the idea of using the basement as an office became too heavy. During the day, we still tried to keep the routine, but any longer stretch of silence made us overly alert. The sound never appeared with background noise. It was always when everything was calm. One of those nights, the ticking started earlier, before 10, while we were still having dinner upstairs. We stopped mid-conversation at the same time. The sound was clearly coming from below, rising up the stairs, as if it were trying to be heard. We went down together without saying anything and stopped on the last step. The basement was dark, but the sound seemed to be in the center of the room. When I turned on the light, it didn't stop. It continued at the same rhythm, indifferent to our presence. My wife suggested we shut off the breaker for the entire house just to eliminate any electrical possibility. The idea seemed excessive, but at that point, we just wanted an answer. We went to the breaker panel, shut everything off, and the entire house fell into total silence. No hum, no lights, nothing. We stood there in the dark, waiting. For about 2 seconds, we heard nothing, and I almost felt relief. Then the ticking came back. It was no longer coming from the center of the basement. It was coming from inside the wall near the stairs. It was more muffled now, as if filtered through something solid. But it was closer, so close that I could feel a faint vibration in the concrete when I touched it. My wife grabbed my arm tightly, and for the first time since we moved in, I felt real physical fear, the kind that makes you want to run without thinking. We ran up the stairs, nearly tripping, leaving the basement in complete darkness. The ticking continued for a few seconds even after we closed the door, now clearly coming from inside the wall that separated the basement from the living room. It was a dry, regular sound, impossible to ignore when everything around it was dead silent. We stood in the living room without lights, without speaking, just listening. Gradually, the sound seemed to rise, not in volume but in position, as if it were following the structure of the house, moving through the internal spaces. When we finally turned the breaker back on, the sound stopped all at once, as if it had never existed. The silence afterward was almost worse. Neither of us said anything at the time, but it was clear we were both thinking the same thing. That night, we slept poorly. Every creak of the house woke us up. I kept trying to identify whether it was wood expanding from the cold or if there was something different in the rhythm. My wife said quietly, already lying down, that she had the impression the sound wasn't a clock marking time, but something trying to keep a rhythm. That stuck in my head. In the middle of the night, I woke up with the clear feeling that I was late for something, even without knowing what. I lay there listening, waiting to hear the ticking again. I didn't hear anything that night, but the silence felt too attentive, as if it were waiting. The next day, we decided not to work in the basement anymore. We moved the computers upstairs, improvised desks in the living room, and pretended it was temporary. During the day, the house seemed normal again. No strange sounds, no odd feelings. Even so, we avoided going down to the basement unless necessary. Late in the afternoon, I went down alone just to grab a box of files. I stayed down there only a few minutes with the light on and didn't hear anything. But as I went back upstairs, I had the clear feeling that the silence was wrong, as if something had been interrupted and was waiting for night to come to continue, and it did. That night, already in bed, we heard the ticking again. It was no longer clearly coming from the basement. It seemed to come from inside the wall behind the headboard. It wasn't distant anymore. It was in the same room. My wife sat up immediately and looked at me with wide eyes. The sound didn't move anymore. It just marked time, regular, insistent, as if it had found the right place. I pressed my ear against the wall and felt a minimal vibration, almost imperceptible but constant. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was too intimate, like something that no longer needed to hide. We got up and went to the guest bedroom carrying blankets and pillows without even discussing it. We closed the door and stayed awake there for a long time, waiting to hear the sound cross the house. It didn't. It stayed where it was. When we finally fell asleep close to dawn, exhaustion overcame fear, but it didn't bring real rest. The next day we talked seriously about leaving the house, not necessarily moving immediately, but not putting down roots there. Something in that house seemed to mark time in a way we weren't meant to hear. A few nights later, the sound stopped. It simply never came back. That was almost more disturbing than when it was there. We expected to hear it, stayed silent on purpose, but nothing happened. The basement remained cold and empty, the walls normal. Even so, we never turned off the breaker at night again. We never used the basement for anything other than quick storage, and we avoid touching the walls when the house gets too quiet. To this day, even living somewhere else, I feel uncomfortable with analog clocks. The sound gives me a strange tightness in my chest, like I'm hearing something I shouldn't. I don't know what that ticking was, or why it moved, or why it continued even without power. I only know that in that house, time didn't seem willing to stand still. And when it finally did, it made it clear it could start again at any moment.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.